Interstitial fluid. The extracellular fluid backing most tissues, excluding the fluid within the lymph and blood vessels.
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and in this video I'm going to talk about interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is a term that confuses students. If you ask them what is a capillary, they know that, they know what's in blood, they know what cells are, and the tissues are made up of cells, but if you ask them what interstitial fluid is, they're confused. And that's too bad, because that's going to be found between the capillary and the cells. And so what is it like, or what does it look like? Well, think about this. This doctor right here is doing arthroscopic surgery on a shoulder. And so how does that work? You've maybe seen videos of that. Well, they put a camera in, and then they're going to introduce fluid in there. But basically, what does it look like inside our body? If you take a camera and put it inside our body, it's not just blood everywhere. The blood is going to be confined to the blood vessels, but there's still going to be fluid inside our body. And what is that fluid? That fluid is called interstitial fluid. And so really, it's going to be what separates all of our cells from the circulatory system. Since we have a closed circulatory system, that means that the blood is going to be maintained within these vessels the whole way around the loops. But how does the material get out of the blood and eventually get into our cells? It goes through the interstitial fluid. And so if you visualize it like this, it's a fluid on the inside of our body that surrounds all the cells, then you're getting there. And so there's microcirculation that takes place at the level of the capillary. And so as the blood is flowing away from the heart, it'll work its way down eventually to the capillary. And what holds the pressure inside a capillary? Well, there's going to be hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure is going to be the pressure out on the capillary. It's pushing out. If you want to get an idea of what that really is, what is that hydrostatic pressure? Well, if you were young and you played with a hose when you're having a water fight, if you could ever get a hold of the hose, and you put your finger on the front of it, you could increase that pressure and squirt it farther. And so that pressure on the inside of the capillary out on that fluid is going to be hydrostatic pressure. And that's going to move fluid outside of the capillary into the interstitial fluid around it. There's also going to be osmotic pressure. What's osmotic pressure? That's going to be water flowing in because we're going to have a higher solute concentration on the inside. So the combination of these two pressures, hydrostatic and then osmotic pressure, is going to create that blood pressure on the inside of our vessels. Again, it's going to be probably greater hydrostatic pressure on the capillary or on the artery side and less on the venule side. Where does the water go, though? When it leaks out, what's going to happen to this water or this fluid as it moves out? Eventually, it's going to move into what are called lymph vessels, and those lymph vessels will return that fluid to the blood. And so the major parts of the blood stay within the capillary, but the fluid is going to move between the two. And so I put together this little diagram to show you that. And so this is a capillary. So the capillary is going to be, if I were to ask you what it's made up of, the capillary itself is going to be made up of cells. And so the surrounding of the capillary, or that tube of the capillary, is going to be made up of endothelial cells. So it's going to be these really thin cells. What's on the inside then of our capillary? This is going to be plasma on the inside, and then we're going to have these red blood cells. We also have platelets in here, and we're going to have white blood cells as well. But if we're just talking about interstitial fluid, this plasma on the inside of our blood is very similar to the interstitial fluid. And so what's going to be in the interstitial fluid? Well, there's going to be a lot of water, but we're also going to have sugar, salt, hormones, neurotransmitters, carbon dioxide, oxygen. And so it serves as a conduit between the capillary and the tissues itself. And so what's a gas that the cells are going to consume? They're going to consume oxygen. How does it get there? Well, it's going to be consumed here in the mitochondria, but it's going to diffuse from the red blood cells through the plasma, through the interstitial fluid, and it's eventually going to move here. What's going to happen to the carbon dioxide? It's going to build up inside the mitochondria. It's going to diffuse out. It's going to diffuse through the interstitial fluid. It's going to diffuse through here, and it's going to be carried as bicarbonate on the red blood cells. And so really inside our body, what do we have? We have cells, and so red blood cells, the lining of the capillary cells, and then clearly all the cells that make up our tissues, and then we're going to have fluids. And really that's it. That's about the two things that we have. We're going to have some things obviously that are matrix made up from material that are produced by cells. But the interstitial, you can see, is very important, that interstitial fluid, because it's going to be what surrounds our cells, and it's going to be how nutrients get from the blood into our cells and waste products get back. That's interstitial fluid. It's clear. If you really want to know what it looks like, well, think about the plasma inside blood, and that's essentially the same thing. And I hope that's helpful.
Formation. Hydrostatic pressure is generated by the systolic force of the heart. It pushes water out of the capillaries. The water potential is created due to the ability of small solutes to pass through the walls of capillaries. This buildup of solutes induces osmosis. The water passes from a high concentration of water outside the vessels to a low concentration inside of the vessels in an attempt to reach an equilibrium. Important. Interstitial fluid is a thin layer of fluid which surrounds the body cells. Interstitial fluid has become useful in the monitoring of glucose levels in people with diabetes.
At the arterial end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is 13 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the capillary into the interstitial fluid. At the venous end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is minus 7 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the interstitial fluid into the capillary. Approximately 9/10 of the fluid that leaves the capillary at its arterial end re-enters the capillary at the venous end. About 1/10 of the fluid passes into the lymphatic capillaries and returns to the bloodstream via the lymphatic system.
Role of interstitial fluid. 1. Interstitial fluid acts like a kind of pooling station in terms of nutrients for our cells. 2. Interstitial fluid contains glucose, salt, fatty acids, and minerals such as calcium, magnesium, and potassium.
Our circulatory system is designed to provide each of our cells with a type of diffusion exchange practiced by simple unicellular organisms living in aquatic environments. This exchange occurs at the level of the tiniest blood vessels, capillaries, where wastes, nutrients, gases, and hormones are exchanged between the blood and the body cells. With walls only a single cell thick, capillaries are well adapted to their role of exchange. Most nutrients, oxygen, and carbon dioxide diffuse readily through capillary cell membranes. Salts and small charged molecules, including some small proteins, move through fluid-filled spaces within the capillary cell membrane or between adjacent capillary cells. Pressure within capillaries causes a continuous leakage of fluid from the blood plasma into the spaces surrounding the capillaries and adjacent tissues. This fluid, known as interstitial fluid, consists primarily of water in which nutrients, hormones, gases, wastes, and small proteins from the blood are dissolved. The exchange of materials between capillary blood and nearby cells occurs through this interstitial fluid, which bathes nearly all the cells of the body. Capillaries are so narrow that red blood cells must pass through them in single file. Consequently, blood is sure to pass very close to the capillary walls. In addition, capillaries are so numerous that no body cell is more than 100 micrometers or 4/1000ths of an inch from a capillary. These factors facilitate the exchange of materials by diffusion. It is estimated that the total length of capillaries in a human is over 80,600 kilometers or 50,000 miles. As blood is forced through this narrow, almost endless network of capillaries, the speed of blood flow drops very quickly. further enhancing diffusion by increasing the amount of time available for the blood and cells to exchange materials.
Composition. Interstitial fluid consists of a water solvent containing sugar, salts, fatty acids, amino acids, coenzymes, hormones, neurotransmitters, and as well as waste products from the cells. The composition of tissue fluid depends upon the exchange between the cells and the biological tissue of the blood.
I am going to talk about interstitial fluid.
At the arterial end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is 13 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the capillary into the interstitial fluid. At the venous end of the capillary, the net filtration pressure is equal to the net hydrostatic pressure minus the net osmotic pressure. The net filtration pressure is minus 7 millimeters of mercury. This causes fluid to move from the interstitial fluid into the capillary. Approximately 9/10 of the fluid that leaves the capillary at its arterial end re-enters the capillary at the venous end. About 1/10 of the fluid passes into the lymphatic capillaries and returns to the bloodstream via the lymphatic system.
The fluid found in the intercellular spaces composed of water, amino acids, sugars, fatty acids, coenzymes, hormones, neurotransmitters, salts, and cellular products. It bathes and surrounds the cell of the body and provides a means of delivering materials to the cells, intercellular communication, and removal of metabolic waste. On average, a person has about 11 liters of interstitial fluid. Pros. The balance between the two forces differs at different points of the capillaries, with the hydrostatic and the osmotic pressure. Interstitial fluid bathes the cell of tissues. This provides a means of delivering materials to the cells, intercellular communication, as well as removal of metabolic waste. To prevent a buildup of tissue fluid surrounding the cells into tissue. The lymphatic system plays a part in the transport of tissue fluid. Tissue fluid can pass into the surrounding lymph vessels and eventually ends up rejoining the blood.
Blood pressure forces a watery fluid from capillary walls into tissue spaces. Most of this fluid re-enters the capillaries, while the remainder passes into adjoining lymphatic vessels as lymph. Red cells remain in the blood capillaries, and some white cells pass out to act as scavengers. Some materials flow out of the capillaries by way of diffusion. Other materials through pores of varying sizes at junctions between capillaries.
Cons. Sometimes the removal of tissue fluid does not function correctly and there is a buildup. This can cause swelling, often around the feet and ankles, which is generally known as edema. The position of swelling is due to the effects of gravity.
Edema means swelling from fluid that accumulates and is trapped in your body's tissues. Edema most commonly occurs in the feet, ankles, and legs, but any part of the body can be affected. The tissues of your body are made up of cells held together by connective tissue. The space between cells that contain connective tissue and tiny blood vessels is called the interstitium. The fluids in your body that are not inside cells are usually stored in your blood vessels and what are called the interstitial spaces, meaning not inside cells. Edema occurs when the tiny blood vessels or capillaries leak fluid into the surrounding tissue spaces. When the interstitial spaces fill with fluid, they expand and the area swells. There are two kinds of edema. In the type called pitting edema, applying pressure to the swollen area causes an indentation that persists after the pressure is released. In non-pitting edema, there is no persistent indentation after pressure is applied.
Edema is a swelling caused by the abnormal buildup of fluid in the body. The fluid collects under the skin within the tissues that are outside of the circulatory system. Edema is most common in the feet and legs, but it can occur in the hands, arms, face, abdomen, where it's called ascites, and around the lungs, where it's called pleural effusion. Cause: cancer, especially kidney, liver, or ovarian cancers. Other medications, including corticosteroids, hormone replacement medication, anti-inflammatory drugs such as ibuprofen or naproxen, and some blood pressure medications. Low levels of proteins in the blood, inactivity which can cause fluid to collect in the feet and legs, problems with kidney, liver, or heart function. In Ecuador, we have another cause of interstitial fluid disease that is associated with altitude sickness. Acute mountain sickness can progress to high-altitude pulmonary edema or high-altitude cerebral edema, which are potentially fatal. Thank you for your attention.
Interstitial fluid and blood sugar levels. The glucose level in interstitial fluid is not quite the same as that in our blood, so a continuous glucose monitor will apply a formula to give a close guideline of what our blood glucose level is likely to be at that point in time. Physiological function. Interstitial fluid bathes the cells of the tissues. This provides a means of delivering materials to the cell's intercellular communication, as well as removal of metabolic waste. The extracellular matrix.
Welcome to USMLEFasttrack.com. The section we're going to talk about today is from First Aid for the USMLE Step 1, 2013 edition. Page 265. Capillary fluid exchange. What are Starling forces? Starling forces are forces that determine fluid movement through the capillary membrane. What does the capillary pressure, also known as PC, do to the fluid? The capillary pressure pushes the fluid out of the capillary. What does the interstitial fluid pressure, also known as the PI, do to the fluid? The interstitial pressure, also known as PI, pushes the fluid into the capillary. What does the plasma colloid osmotic pressure, also known as Pi-C, do to the fluid? The plasma colloid osmotic pressure, also known as Pi-C, pulls fluid into capillary. What does the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, known as Pi-I, do to the fluid? The interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, Pi-I, pulls the fluid out of the capillary. So you can also think of the colloid osmotic pressure as the attraction pressure, so it pulls towards it. What is the equation of net filtration pressure? The equation for net filtration pressure is P net equals, you first take the capillary pressure and you subtract that with the interstitial fluid pressure. Secondly, you take the plasma colloid osmotic pressure and you subtract that with the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure. Whatever answer you get for the first part, you subtract that with the second part, and that will give you the P net. What is the filtration constant, also known as the Kf? The filtration constant is the capillary permeability, which is a constant. What is the equation for the net fluid flow, also known as the JV? The net fluid flow is the filtration constant times the P net, which is the net filtration pressure. Where is the fluid building up in conditions such as edema? In conditions such as edema, the fluid is collecting in the interstitium. What are some of the conditions that would lead to edema? Edema is caused by conditions that increases the capillary pressure. This would mean that fluid is pushed out of the capillary into the interstitium, and this happens in conditions such as heart failure. It also can happen when there is decrease in the amount of plasma protein, and this is a condition when there would be a decrease in the plasma colloid osmotic pressure. This happens in conditions such as nephrotic syndrome and liver failure, and what's happening here is the pull of the capillary is going down. So it's not attracting enough fluid back into the capillary. That means there's going to be more fluid into the interstitium, and therefore there would be edema built up in the interstitium. Edema can also build up in conditions which leads to increase in capillary permeability. That means that the filtration constant will increase, and this happens in conditions such as toxins, infections, or in burns. You can also have edema built up in conditions where there is an increase in the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, which means that the interstitium is going to pull more fluid out of the capillary into the interstitium. And this happens in conditions such as lymphatic blockage.
For more information on this topic, click on the link in the description section below. For a full USMLE Step 1 review, be sure to check us out at usmlefasttrack.com, where we help you review the entire first aid for the USMLE Step 1 with high-quality videos and hundreds of detailed pictures for a better understanding of the material. So to learn from the best USMLE review book, be sure to check us out at usmlefasttrack.com.
The interstitial fluid. The major types of protein in the matrix are structural proteins and adhesive proteins. Function. Contain the nutrients necessary for cell function: electrolytes, carbohydrates, amino acids, lipids. Functions as a support of the tissue, giving form and structure.